So, Stefano, are you ready?
I am, yeah. Can you hear me,
Perfect.
right? Okay.
Yes. So I'm going to announce you. So we start again.
And security researchers and privacy advocates are much less trusted than these individuals. So contact tracing takes advantage of that in its manual basic form. However, if we move to apps, then the situation is very different. I mean, we are already pre-trained to be concerned about privacy of apps. We understand that many useful functionalities come with a privacy risk or some risk of tracking. And in fact, this is a survey from the Washington Post that was published the week when Apple and Google announced their intention to provide a solution for exposure notification. And smartphone users were almost evenly split at that point on whether they would adopt this technology. And the main reason for skepticism was, of course, the fact that users do not trust tech companies like Apple and Google to secure their data and not to track them. And so I think it was clear that if you want to develop apps that are part of a public health response, then you have to set a very high bar to ensure trust. And privacy and security are definitely the first thing you might want to think about, especially if you are a computer scientist. But definitely the other fundamental aspect is that you want this solution to be meaningful and be accurate and provide meaningful data to the system and meaningful contribution to fighting the pandemic. And also there should be governance and legislation around it that encourages adoption of this solution. And of course, it should be entirely voluntary, and it should be guaranteed that the solution is turned off when it's no longer needed. And so in this talk, I want to focus on the three items, the first three items in particular, and discuss a little bit what has been done, why certain choices have been made, and what can we actually do better. So let me start with privacy and security. And this is perhaps the more technical part of this talk, even though it's going to be very, very brief. So if we look at the main critiques of the Google and Apple protocol and all sort of attacks that have come out, I'd say that the vast majority really boil down to three issues that all of these protocols have, also the other academic protocols that have been proposed, is that first of all, these protocols can leak to a malicious version of the app, when the time and what the time and the location of an exposure has been, and this can be correlated with other information like, say, cameras or other contextual information. And also, it's always possible to link two exposures over the same day to whether they belong to the same individual or not. And finally, another issue that was also part of Rosario's work that was presented before are relay attacks on the system. And now the question, of course, has been for us as cryptographers whether we can do better on these fronts, and whether we can maybe have impact on Google and Apple to improve on these fronts. But one lesson here is that if you want to suggest anything, you really have to appreciate the complexity of the system and the scale of the system which is being deployed. And this is just an illustration of the system we are deploying in the United States. And it's really a massive endeavor. So basically the way the solution works in the US, the similar solution in Europe, is that we do rely on a national key server to allow for a cross-state traffic, which is run by a nonprofit and is hosted by Microsoft. And then every state will replicate locally some infrastructure. And this is due to the fact that different states have different platforms on which they base their healthcare IT. And every state will in particular manage the upload authorization of keys to these remote servers. So basically they will have a server that is responsible to issue valid PIN codes to health officials. These PIN codes are given to positive individuals would then upload their keys. And this process is actually a two-step process, which involves some cryptography, where the keys, in fact, a hash of the keys is sent to a local server run by the state to obtain an upload certificate anonymously. And then this upload certificate is going to be used to upload the keys to the national server. And every phone in the country, so we're talking about 350 million inhabitants plus, is going to sync with this one central server. And so, for example, if you want to remove this issue or make it at least hard to learn time and location of an exposure, that's already almost impossible to solve at this scale, because all solutions I know of that can do that are based on things like private site intersection, or in fact even stronger variants of it where you only leak whether there exists an intersection. And there are fairly practical systems that do this, but they really do not scale server side to this scale. And in fact, they don't even entirely protect, if you think about it, against this type of attacks, because you can still cleverly have a malicious app just check for exposure on maliciously chosen subsets of the identifiers they collected to learn which ones trigger an exposure by doing some binary search, maybe distributed over multiple devices. All of this can be done, and it's really hard to prevent. There were some attempts to use clever cryptography. There's a nice proposal by the MIT group called Clever Parrot that does this without using private site intersection solutions, but it's actually very easy to break again if you consider an app which is malicious. Again, it only protects against semi-honest attackers. So another issue that has come up, and I think more prominently, is the issue of linking, because that's something that seemingly we can prevent. And this is due to the fact that in the Google Apple protocol, the identifiers that are broadcast by the phones in their proximity are all derived from daily keys in a deterministic way by using a so-called pseudo-random function. So if you don't know the key, these identifiers look random. If you know the key, you can reconstruct all of the identifiers over a single day. And the problem here, again, why this has been done, at least one reason for this, is again, scalability. If you have one national server and you are dealing loads like, say, hypothetically, you have 50,000 positive users per day, which would be roughly 1/3 of what we actually have in the US. I don't think we will get there in terms of deployment, but that's what the system is designed for. Then that basically means that if you use daily keys, every single phone that uses exposure notification will download roughly 12.5 megabytes per day from the server. And of course, the most naive thing you could do if you want to improve remove linkability is that you just upload all of the identifiers you broadcast without daily keys. You make them look unrelated. But if you do that, then suddenly the bandwidth consumption for every user will go up massively to more than 1 gigabyte per day of downloads, so which is really not feasible. So there is a very pragmatic choice here of making the system scalable. There is also another problem why it has been very hard to argue away this linkability. It's really the discussion with healthcare, the healthcare side. Linkability, in a way, it's also desired for assessing exposure, because you need to make sure that you satisfy meaningful exposure guidelines, which typically will tell you something. If you say closer than 2 meters for at least 50 minutes, and these 50 minutes, according to newer guidelines, might not even be contiguous, then you should trigger an exposure. And if you cannot link the identifiers you collected as belonging to the same users, this risk assessment is very hard. But that's another reason why preventing this, doing anything in this direction was hard. Finally, the other issues was that of relay attacks. So again, here I'm referring to the fact that you can have multiple clones of the same app that are going to broadcast identical identifiers at different locations, so that if one of them reports positive, then you create a very large number of false positives. And here the irony is that there are very elegant fixes to this problem that can be cheaply embedded into the Google Apple solution. There's a very elegant proposal by Krzysztof Pietrzak. But you need to rely on location and GPS access to fix this. And really, this has been a huge no-go area. I think one lesson that you learn in trying to deploy apps at scale is that users really do not trust apps as soon as the app asks you for location access, and you need to set permissions. There's no other way for an app to actually use GPS to prevent relay attacks than giving these permissions to the app. And at that point, the entire narrative for privacy of these apps falls apart. And so you're really stuck between a rock and a hard place, where if you have location access off, this is a good thing, but then you don't have any relay attack protection. And if you want to have relay attack protection, then location access needs to be on, which is a negative for the app. And I think the pragmatic bottom line here, which is rather fatalistic, is that we've seen it even here in deployment. Yesterday, the location privacy issue comes up right away. That's what everyone asked, whereas nobody could care less about relay attacks. Rosario has been doing some excellent work here on advocacy, but unfortunately doesn't reach out to the general population. So there was a pragmatic choice here. So I guess what I want you to understand here is that we have thought from the very beginning about these issues, and even when we designed PACT, we definitely had these issues in mind, but there's really some pragmatic choices here that you have to make, and you're not going to end up with a perfect solution if you really want to deploy. So finishing this here, I want to talk a little bit more high level on the other question, which was already addressed in the prior talk, which is that of accuracy, because here it's really the part where I think we could do and we should have done much better in terms of testing whether the system works at all to the degree we expect it to. The irony here, of course, to start with, is that because we have privacy by design, we really cannot perform any evaluation that is meaningful in understanding, for example, how many exposures are even given to the users and other sort of things we might like to understand. And so the only thing we can do is actually perform some user studies, which, as far as I know, I'm reporting here to the first one, which was the Swiss one, have been somewhat inconclusive, in my opinion, in telling us much about the actual how effective these solutions are. I mean, what we could see there is that there was maybe roughly a factor of 10. Between the number of people that were being tested positive and went there because of an actual referral from manual contact tracing, and 1/10 of those numbers were those that were there for an exposure notification alert. But I'm sure maybe Serge has talked about this. I couldn't attend this talk. I mean, there are some other issues with the study. So it's very hard to actually give a proper user study, so we don't have good numbers. What was visible even from the study is that the numbers are seemingly very low in terms of how many users are actually channeled into testing through exposure alerts. And that is really also due to the fact that we have very low adoption, and that makes it very hard to even assess whether the system is working as we expected it initially to be, because the numbers are so low. So adoption peaks in Ireland, and I think the numbers might have changed a little bit by now, but we rarely see anything which goes above usually 30%, and mostly it's less. And so what we really encounter here as a problem is the fact that obviously in many cases either users are positive, but people that should be alerted if they were in proximity are not alerted because they were not running the app, or the positive users did not have an app running, so they cannot alert anyone. And this is obviously a huge impact on the reliability of the system. And so you sort of get stuck in what I like to call a chicken and egg problem here, where in a way, it's really the accuracy of the system that increases trust, but it is actually the trust that will increase adoption and then will increase accuracy. And so if you don't resolve this chicken and egg problem, you really cannot bootstrap exposure notification to scale to a level where it's actually meaningful. And this, of course, comes with a number of other things that I don't have time to discuss, which I'm sure have been addressed elsewhere. For example, the fact that accuracy is also affected by physical layer issues. Distance measurement is not as precise as we want it to be. It's not clear whether medium access control issues will play a role in even detecting contacts if you're in a very dense environment, and where many users actually end up using. And there's also sort of usability issues that might discourage users. The fact that the system needs to be able to take care of people that have received exposure alerts, and users needs to be incentivized to actually report as positive in the system. And finally, there is this healthy debates we're having here right now, which is very good for discussing privacy of the solutions and other aspect, but it also has been fueling a narrative which is very much driven by politics here in the US, which also propagates certain conspiracy theories that about government tracking and so on, that have definitely been limiting adoption and affecting this chicken and egg problem. So I think one thing that I found a little bit sad that was not taken more seriously is so the discussion of how to roll out properly. So something I've been really suggesting, but we came very close to do this here in the state of Washington, but I don't think it was done in a way that as good as it could have been, was to really think more carefully about rolling out exposure notification and focus actually on having pockets of deployment where you get the conditions you expect if you had a very good adoption. So for example, you could deploy them on a university campus where you can incentivize students to actually use it and to take part in a test and get a high pocket of adoption so that you can evaluate the system running in good condition. And then you can evaluate it and see if you actually have good adoption, it will work this well, or it will actually not work. And then learn lessons from there that will impact then a wider scale adoption. So if it works well, you can leverage these experiments to actually increase trust. If it doesn't work well, then you actually know that it doesn't work well, even if you have a high adoption, and then you can just discard the solution. And here I want to give credit for Serge for this term of a placebo app. I think is the one who brought it up to me. It would be also nice to have, you can also have an accurate comparison with other measures. So every measure against a pandemic should have at least an expected success that you can assess and then decide how it integrates with other measure. And it's very hard to do that if you just roll out and hope that it goes well. And also, as Nuria was mentioning, another problem we encounter in the US, we have massive equity issues, is that it's really hard, even if you have ideal adoption, to use an app to serve those parts of society that actually need it. So what you have here are two maps of the Seattle metro area. And the one on the left measures something which is called the equity index. So roughly what these colors mean is that the darker a color here is, the poorer an area is, and perhaps more ethnically diverse, but poorer, whereas the brighter areas are less diverse and wealthier. And on the right-hand side, what you can see is a map of the density of positive COVID cases. This is even a bit updated. Things are far worse right now. And what you see is that the areas that are poorer obviously have the ones that have a massive problem with the pandemic, whereas areas that are wealthier, the situation is much less problematic. But these are exactly the areas where people will tend to use the app. And so it's not clear how to even solve this problem. I mean, you can have certain thoughts, for example, try to offload resources from areas where the app works and push them to poorer areas. But unfortunately, because we can't measure well how the app works, then it's very hard to implement this vision. And so I want to conclude the second part by just pointing out that at least here in Washington, we had a lot of pressure from the population, in fact, in complaining about the fact that the exposure notification has been rolled out relatively late. But I think it's important to understand, and this is my thesis, that delayed rollout doesn't mean incompetence in rolling out the technology. It doesn't mean that if you roll out early, you're incompetent, but it definitely doesn't mean that you're incompetent if you don't roll out at all or if you roll out late. In fact, if you look here, it's a bit provocative and I'm trolling a little bit, but if you look at the countries that have developed first, think about like Switzerland have deployed first, or the state in the US like North Dakota that went first. These are places where COVID cases exploded again, even after they had the app. And if you compare with Washington State or California, which actually are only deploying right now, they could actually keep the pandemic under control. In fact, here the numbers are to scale, these plots from the Washington Post, and they could keep the pandemic under control through other means which had nothing to do with apps. Okay, so you don't need an app. An app is just an extra layer, and if you want to deploy it, you have to think carefully, and we definitely have been doing that. Now, the final thing I want to talk about is sort of acknowledging the elephant in the room, and that's the issue of governance and legal aspects. And here, so I have to say that definitely when you try to deploy this technology, one issue that you do have to deal with is the fact that Google and Apple control the platform. And I honestly do not believe that there is anything to be really fearful about, just because the legal exposure and just the attention on these companies related to this product is really so big. And this thing is really a nightmare for any major corporation and their legal teams to deploy. So I'm not really expecting that something really happens, but the point is that it doesn't matter. So ultimately, remember, we are trying to build trust. And this is really about what users believe and not what is really happening. And that is a problem because a large number of users do not trust Apple and Google. You also create some like limited interactions with them on trying to modify, try to modify the solution and try to make changes, there is an inherent problem in the fact that basically in the US, you have one team per state at most, and abroad, one team per country who have access to the platform. So it's really hard to analyze the APIs. Those who have access usually are not in a position to actually do security penetration testing. And also another problem that we encountered is that because you need this state endorsement, it's very hard to, for example, do what I suggested before. When we deployed the COVID Safe app, we released it, we didn't deploy it, and we made it available. We had huge interest in adopting it from university campuses who wanted to then promote the technology to their state governments. But once it was clear that Google and Apple are the way to go, then this was hard to do, because you couldn't do anything without having an endorsement from the state. So there was this barrier of entry, which was very hard to go through. But on the other hand,
Excuse me?
Yeah?
Just 5 minutes left, just to let you
I'm
know.
almost done, yeah, thank you. Yeah, I'm almost done. Actually, it's gonna be less than 5 minutes. The other point, however, that I want to offer here is that we try to come up with an app developed in academia, and it's really hard if you want to deploy it to just do this inside academia. So tech companies are really good at doing what they do, and if you want to have a chance to deploy exposure notification at scale, they are better at doing that than we are, and definitely this has shown itself. But I think here a fair point I want to make is that here I think what was done wrong, it should have been done better, was to discuss the governance model at the beginning. I think when academia and politics could have pushed for a governance model where definitely Apple and Google were needed and could have had a place at the table, but there would be some other entity that would take part in making decisions. And I think this could have done. But unfortunately, if you go back and take a very self-critical viewpoint, we all have been pushing for viewpoints. So many of us have been signing open letters that if you go back and read them, definitely have just endorsed things the way we're going, and have enabled things to be the way they are right now. And I think there's also a little bit of computer science academia mindset there, which kind of makes us think about industry adoption as the ultimate goal. And I think that has maybe brought many to be happy that actually Google and Apple were picking this up rather than having a more critical viewpoint. I think another pragmatic issue we encountered here is that if you adopt this solution, and this, of course, in the US, you have this replicated many times across states, the things are set up in a way that even though you're adopting a solution from Google and Apple, the states have to deal with the legal aspects of this themselves. And so you have 50 times the issue of like, how do we write terms of service? How do we write a privacy policy? And this is a very daunting task because there's no precedent for anything like this. There's a lot of attention, there's a lot of risk associated with this, there's a lot of legal exposure, and every single state needs to decide what their policy is. You want to write something like it doesn't collect any private, personally identifiable information, but who really knows what is legally true? We don't have any precedents about that. Right, and someone is writing in the chat, so Claude, of course they are, right? But the question is even harder than that, because that's the answer that we give as computer scientists, but that's not the answer the lawyers are going to give, right? And so lawyers are going to think about it in different terms, and so you need to have a lawsuit, right? To assess that, at least in the US system, right? And I'm happy to discuss that, but I actually agree with what you're saying, Claude, by the way. I'm referring to the chat in case you're confused.
Okay, so.
Yeah.
Sorry,
yeah.
Are you finished?
I'm done, yeah. So just wanted to conclude. So I think what is clear is that this is really not a silver bullet. What we had here, it really needs to be integrated with an existing infrastructure. It's a compromise. We really didn't do any testing to figure out whether it's effective if rolled out properly. And if you want to give alternative proposal as a researcher, you should really think about these challenges carefully to be taken seriously. That's all I wanted to say. Yeah. All right.
Okay,
yeah,
thanks
so
a lot, Stefano.
Yeah.
And now we go to the question part. Any question? I currently don't see the raising hands.
Yeah, I think Claude was discussing this issue of PIIs, and I think just briefly I think the issue there, right, is that there is a different interpretation if you actually have GDPR in place or the legal setup that we have in the US, where honestly only California has strong guidelines that are based on GDPR. And there's people try to adhere to that because you want to deploy, of course, also in California, but there is nothing as clear as that. And I think what would be helpful is to have some existing core decision like we had in the case of IP addresses, where the things are pretty nuanced, and that will help them. So I'm not trying to say that I disagree with that. Of course, I think the response I gave is that these are personally identifiable information, but it's not the same language the lawyers speak, and this creates a huge burden and a huge debate. It needs to be replicated 50 times across all states, and that was a very, very challenging point. I think you agree there.
So thanks a lot. Lisa, is there any other question for Stefano?
I will check. I can't see. Please raise your hand if you have a question.
So
Otherwise,
Stefano, would you please unshare, or I can override?
Oh,
you?
yeah. No, I can unshare. Yeah.
No problem.
Yeah.
no, not in the chat. No rising hands.